In the suffocating heat of Louisiana, where Spanish moss hangs from ancient oak trees like shrouds, stands a mansion that has witnessed more darkness than most historians dare to document. This is the story of Myrtles Plantation, a home built on blood, maintained through terror, and now marketed as charming entertainment. But the real horror isn't in the ghost stories tourists pay to hear. It's in the documented history that no amount of paranormal activity could ever adequately represent. The year is 1796. General David Bradford is running for his life. A lawyer and wealthy landowner from Pennsylvania, Bradford led the Whiskey Rebellion against the federal government, an armed uprising of farmers refusing to pay taxes on their distilled spirits. When President George Washington himself led 13,000 troops to crush the rebellion, Bradford knew his fate was sealed. Capture meant execution for treason. So he fled south, deep into the swamps of Louisiana, carrying enough money to start over and determined to rebuild his fortune on someone else's suffering. Bradford purchased 600 acres of prime Louisiana land in what's now St. Francisville. The location wasn't random. This was Tunica territory, indigenous land that had been systematically cleared through violence and forced removal. The soil was rich, perfect for indigo and cotton, and far enough from federal authorities that a wanted man could live comfortably if he had the resources. And Bradford had resources. Within months of his arrival, he began construction on what he called Laurel Grove, a plantation house that would eventually become known by a far more sinister name. The mansion that rose from that stolen land was impressive by any standard. 10 main rooms spread across 2 stories, each one larger than entire homes most people would ever see. Elaborate plasterwork adorned the ceilings. French crystal chandeliers caught the Louisiana sunlight. A gallery wrapped around the entire structure, supported by columns that gave the house an air of classical respectability. But every nail driven, every board laid, every decorative flourish was accomplished through forced labor. Bradford didn't build this mansion himself. He didn't even supervise most of the construction. That work fell to the dozens of enslaved people he purchased with his Pennsylvania money. These were human beings whose names we'll never know, whose stories were never recorded, whose labor built a monument to their own oppression. While Bradford lived in temporary quarters, directing his agricultural operations and planning his architectural vision, unnamed men and women worked through brutal Louisiana summers to erect his palace. The plantation system Bradford established was typical for the region, which is to say it was absolutely nightmarish. Enslaved people worked from sunrise to sunset in the fields, their lives measured only by their productivity. Children were separated from parents when it suited economic interests. Women faced systematic assault with no legal recourse. Men were worked until their bodies failed, then replaced like broken tools. The beautiful home tourists photographed today was sustained by this daily horror for decades. Bradford died in 1808, leaving the plantation to his widow Elizabeth and their children. Elizabeth remarried a man named Clark Woodruff, and this is where the documented death toll really begins to stack up. The Woodruff era of Myrtles Plantation marked a period of particularly well-documented tragedy, though whether from natural causes, violence, or deliberate acts remains disputed in many cases. Here's where the most famous legend emerges, the story that every ghost tour operator loves to tell. According to popular accounts, there was an enslaved woman named Chloe who served the Woodruff family. The stories vary in details, but the most common version claims that Chloe was caught eavesdropping on family conversations. As punishment, her ear was cut off. To cover her disfigurement, she wore a green turban. Seeking revenge, or perhaps trying to prove her worth, Chloe supposedly baked a birthday cake laced with oleander poison. The plan allegedly went wrong. Instead of just making the family sick enough to need her care, the poison killed Sarah Woodruff and 2 of her daughters. According to legend, the other enslaved people, terrified of collective punishment, hanged Chloe themselves and threw her body in the Mississippi River. Her ghost supposedly haunts the plantation to this day, still wearing that green turban, eternally seeking forgiveness for murders she may never have committed. It's a chilling story. It's also almost certainly fiction. Here's what we know from actual historical records. Sarah Matilda Woodruff died in 1823, along with her children Cornelia and James. But they didn't die from poisoning. Death records from the period list yellow fever as the cause. Yellow fever was epidemic in Louisiana throughout the 1820s, killing thousands. The symptoms matched, the timing matched, and there's no contemporary account of any murder investigation or slave execution related to these deaths. So where did the Chloe story come from? Most likely from the same place many ghost stories originate, someone's imagination, polished over time into local legend. There's no record of any enslaved woman named Chloe at Myrtles Plantation. No documentation of an ear cutting, no mention of a hanging. The earliest versions of this story don't appear until the 1950s, more than a century after the alleged events. But here's the deeply disturbing part. While the Chloe legend is probably false, it's built on a foundation of absolute truth. Enslaved people at Myrtles Plantation and throughout the South absolutely were mutilated as punishment. Ears were cut off. Fingers were removed, backs were scarred beyond recognition through whipping. And enslaved people absolutely were hanged, sometimes by their own community members who faced collective punishment if they didn't comply with their enslavers' demands. The specific story of Chloe might be invented, but the horrors it describes were terrifyingly real and commonplace, and the deaths at Myrtles didn't stop with the Woodruff family. The plantation changed hands multiple times throughout the 19th century, and with each transition came more tragedy. In 1854, the plantation was sold to Ruffin Gray Sterling. Sterling's tenure at Myrtles was brief and ended in one of the few murders that's absolutely confirmed. On a winter evening in January 1865, Sterling was standing on the gallery of his home when someone shot him through the chest. He staggered into the house, tracking blood across the floor as he tried to reach the main staircase. By some accounts, he made it up 17 steps before collapsing. He died from his wounds, and the identity of his killer was never conclusively determined, though the timing suggests it may have been related to Civil War tensions that were tearing Louisiana apart. The Civil War period marked another dark chapter for Myrtles. Union and Confederate forces both occupied the area at different times. The plantation was raided repeatedly. Enslaved people, seeing their opportunity for freedom, fled when Union troops approached. Some stayed, having nowhere else to go and no resources to start over. The legal end of slavery didn't mean the end of exploitation at Myrtles. Like plantations throughout the South, Myrtles transitioned to sharecropping, a system designed to keep formerly enslaved people in perpetual debt and dependence. After the war, the plantation continued to decline. Owners came and went. The house fell into disrepair. Rooms that once hosted elaborate parties sat empty and rotting. The fields that had produced cotton and indigo became overgrown, but the stories persisted and grew. Every creaking floorboard became evidence of supernatural activity. Every cold draft was a ghostly presence. Every shadow was Chloe, still wandering in her green turban. By the early 20th century, Myrtles Plantation had become something of a local curiosity. The house was old, deteriorating, and allegedly haunted. It changed hands several more times, with each owner attempting various schemes to make the property profitable. Some tried to restore the agricultural operations. Others attempted to modernize the house. But the plantation's glory days, built as they were on human bondage, were never coming back. Then came Marjorie Munson in 1951. Munson bought the property and immediately recognized that she wasn't sitting on a cotton plantation anymore. She was sitting on a ghost story gold mine. Munson began heavily promoting the supernatural aspects of Myrtles, giving tours, encouraging legends, and generally transforming the site from a decaying plantation into Louisiana's most famous haunted house. This is when many of the stories we hear today were either invented or dramatically embellished. The tale of Chloe crystallized during this period. Stories of other ghosts multiplied. The mirror in the front hallway supposedly trapped the spirits of Sarah Woodruff and her children. Photographs began showing mysterious orbs and shadowy figures. Visitors reported cold spots, unexplained sounds, and feelings of being watched. Every creak of the old house's settling foundation became evidence of paranormal activity. In 1970, James and Frances Myers purchased Myrtles and continued the haunted house marketing strategy. They conducted a seance that allegedly revealed that not just 10, but potentially dozens of people had died violent deaths on the property. The number 10 became the official count, though which 10 deaths those were supposed to be has never been clearly documented. Under the Myers ownership, Myrtles was featured in numerous paranormal publications and television shows. The current incarnation of Myrtles as a bed and breakfast and tourist attraction began in earnest in the 1990s. Visitors can now pay to sleep in the same rooms where people were allegedly murdered, poisoned, and died of disease. Ghost tours run nightly, with guides sharing increasingly elaborate versions of the property's legends. Paranormal investigation teams conduct regular overnight sessions, capturing hours of footage of old house settling sounds that get interpreted as ghostly activity. The business model is brilliant in its simplicity. Take a genuinely historical building with a genuinely horrific past, add a thick layer of unverifiable ghost stories, charge premium prices, and watch the tourists roll in. Myrtles has been featured on countless television shows, from Travel Channel specials to paranormal reality series. It's been called America's most haunted house, one of the most haunted places on Earth, and has appeared on every conceivable list of spooky destinations. But here's what gets lost in all the ghost tour marketing and paranormal enthusiasm. The real horror of Myrtles Plantation isn't supernatural, it's historical, it's documented, it's undeniable. This was a site where human beings were bought and sold like livestock, where children grew up knowing they could be separated from their parents at any moment for any reason, where women had no bodily autonomy and faced assault as a routine aspect of plantation life, where men worked themselves to death in fields they could never own, producing wealth they could never access, where the punishment for resistance could be mutilation, torture, or death. The Spanish moss, hanging from those ancient oaks, wasn't always just atmospheric decoration. In the plantation era, those trees often served as lynching sites. The beautiful gardens weren't peaceful retreats, but agricultural laboratories, where enslaved people experimented with crops to maximize their enslavers' profits. The kitchen where Chloe supposedly baked her poisoned cake was more likely a place where enslaved cooks prepared elaborate meals for the family while subsisting on scraps themselves. The true death toll at Myrtles Plantation isn't 10 people. It's not even the dozens suggested by various paranormal investigations. It's the cumulative total of every person who died in bondage on that property over more than 60 years of plantation operations. It's the children who didn't survive infancy because enslaved mothers couldn't provide adequate care while being forced to work. It's the men who died from untreated injuries sustained in the fields or from diseases that were entirely preventable with proper medical care. It's the women who died in childbirth because they received no prenatal care and were expected back at work days after delivery. These deaths weren't investigated. They weren't mourned publicly. They weren't recorded in detail because enslaved people weren't considered fully human under the law. Their deaths were economic setbacks for their enslavers, nothing more. No ghost tours memorialize them. No legends preserve their names. No paranormal investigators search for their spirits in the night. And this is the fundamental problem with how we remember and market places like Myrtles Plantation. We've taken genuine sites of historical atrocity and transformed them into entertainment venues. We've replaced uncomfortable truths about American history with comforting ghost stories that allow us to be scared without being challenged. We can spend a night at Myrtles, enjoy the thrill of possibly seeing a ghost, post our spooky photos to social media, and go home feeling like we've experienced history without ever confronting what actually happened there. The historical record doesn't support most of the supernatural claims made about Myrtles. Professional paranormal investigators who've examined the evidence with any skepticism have found natural explanations for virtually all the allegedly ghostly phenomena. The mysterious handprints on mirrors are likely oils from human hands, perfectly normal in a house that sees thousands of tourists annually. The cold spots are drafts in a 200-year-old building with imperfect insulation. The orbs in photographs are typically dust particles or camera artifacts. The creaking sounds are exactly what you'd expect from antique wooden floors and settling foundations. But debunking the ghost stories doesn't make Myrtles Plantation less disturbing. If anything, it makes it more so. Because the real history is far more horrifying than any paranormal legend. The systematic dehumanization of enslaved people, the casual violence of plantation life, the generational trauma inflicted on families that were bought, sold, and scattered, these realities are more terrifying than any ghost because they actually happened. Consider the economics of the plantation system. At its peak, Myrtles Plantation was valued at over $100,000, an enormous sum in the mid-19th century. But the majority of that valuation wasn't in land or buildings. It was in human property. Enslaved people were literally the most valuable assets on the plantation's ledgers. An adult male field worker might be valued at $1,500. A skilled craftsperson could be worth twice that. Children, once old enough to work, had monetary value assigned to them. Entire family wealth structures in the antebellum South were built on these human commodities. When we focus exclusively on ghost stories, we allow ourselves to forget this. We can be entertained by tales of Chloe's ghost without thinking about the real women who served the Woodruff family, whose actual names and stories we'll never know. We can thrill to stories of children's footsteps in the hallways without contemplating the real enslaved children who grew up in those quarters, knowing their childhood would end the moment they were old enough to work. The tourism industry around Myrtles has created a sanitized version of plantation history. The house is presented as a beautiful example of antebellum architecture, which it is, but that beauty was created by and sustained through brutal exploitation. The grounds are described as serene and picturesque, which they are, but that serenity was purchased with decades of forced labor. The ghost stories are marketed as thrilling entertainment, which they are for many visitors, but they paper over real horror with fictional scares. This isn't unique to Myrtles. Plantation tourism throughout the South faces this same challenge. How do you acknowledge the historical reality of these sites without making visitors uncomfortable enough to stop coming? How do you generate revenue from historical properties that require expensive maintenance while honestly confronting what they represent? Many plantations have chosen to emphasize the architecture, the gardens, the stories of the white families who lived there, and increasingly, the ghost stories. The lives of enslaved people, when mentioned at all, are often relegated to brief mentions or separate tours that visitors can easily skip. Some plantations have tried to do better. Whitney Plantation in Louisiana, for example, has centered its entire interpretive mission around the experience of enslaved people. But Whitney is the exception. Most plantation tourism sites, including Myrtles, continue to prioritize entertainment and aesthetics over historical accuracy and moral reckoning. The paranormal angle provides an especially convenient escape from this discomfort. Ghosts are exciting, but ultimately unthreatening to our self-conception as modern, progressive people. We can believe in spirits without confronting our society's foundational relationship with slavery. We can be scared of supernatural entities without being disturbed by human evil. We can enjoy a spooky story without examining our own complicity in systems of oppression that continue to this day. Because here's the thing that makes Myrtles Plantation truly frightening. The wealth generated there didn't disappear when slavery ended. It transferred to subsequent generations. It became investment capital. It funded education, business ventures, and property acquisitions that compounded over time. Many families who built their fortunes on plantation slavery remain wealthy today, while the descendants of enslaved people face systematic disadvantages in wealth accumulation, education, and economic opportunity. The legal structures that enabled plantation slavery were dismantled during Reconstruction, but many of their effects persist. The racial wealth gap in America directly traces back to the fact that one group of people spent centuries building wealth through forced labor, while another group was legally prevented from accumulating any wealth at all. When enslaved people were freed, they received no compensation for their labor, no land to farm, no resources to build with. They started from less than zero, often in debt to former enslavers through sharecropping arrangements. So when we visit Myrtles Plantation today, we're not just visiting a site of historical horror. We're visiting a physical manifestation of wealth inequality that continues to shape American society. Every carefully restored architectural detail represents labor that was never compensated. Every acre of those beautiful grounds represents land that was stolen first from indigenous people, then worked by enslaved people who could never own it. Every dollar of tourism revenue generated today builds on a foundation of historical exploitation. Now, you might be thinking, isn't this a bit heavy for a ghost story? Shouldn't we be able to enjoy a spooky tale without a lecture on American history and ongoing inequality? And that's exactly the question we should be asking ourselves. Why are we more comfortable with ghost stories than with history? Why do we prefer mysterious supernatural explanations to documented human atrocity? What does it say about us that we've turned sites of genuine suffering into theme park attractions? The answer, uncomfortable as it is, involves our collective desire to avoid guilt and responsibility. Ghost stories let us engage with plantation history at a safe emotional distance. The ghosts aren't angry about slavery, they're just spooky. The haunting isn't a metaphor for ongoing injustice, it's just entertainment. We can visit, get scared, feel like we've connected with history, and leave without changing anything about how we understand our world or our place in it. But the people who died at Myrtles Plantation, whether from disease, violence, overwork, or deliberate cruelty, deserve better than to be reduced to tourist attraction fodder. The Woodruff children who died of yellow fever deserve to be remembered as real children who suffered and died, not as ghostly props in a scary story. The enslaved people who built and maintained that plantation deserve to have their names remembered, their stories told, their humanity acknowledged. Instead, we know endless details about supposed paranormal activity, but almost nothing about the actual people who lived and died there. We can recite the legend of Chloe, but not the names of real enslaved women who worked at Myrtles. We photograph mysterious orbs and mirrors, but ignore the historical photographs that document the reality of plantation life. Research into Myrtles Plantation's actual history reveals a far more complex and disturbing story than any ghost tale. Property records show the buying and selling of human beings, with prices listed alongside descriptions like livestock. Plantation ledgers document punishments, injuries, and deaths in the same matter-of-fact tone used for weather observations and crop yields. These aren't exciting supernatural mysteries. They're evidence of systematic dehumanization on an industrial scale. The post-Civil War history of Myrtles is equally revealing. Like many plantations, Myrtles struggled to adapt to free labor. Former enslavers complained endlessly about having to pay wages, about workers demanding humane treatment, about the loss of absolute control over other people's lives. Sharecropping arrangements were designed to recreate as much of the plantation system as legally possible, keeping black workers in perpetual debt and dependence. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, violence remained a constant presence in the region. Lynching was common. Black codes and then Jim Crow laws ensured legal subordination. The Klan operated openly, and Myrtles Plantation, as a symbol of the old plantation order, existed within this context of ongoing white supremacy and racial terror. These are the real hauntings of this place, not mysterious footsteps or ghostly figures in photographs. The decision to market Myrtles as a haunted house, rather than honestly confronting its history, wasn't inevitable. It was a choice made by successive owners who recognized that tourists would pay more for ghost stories than for history lessons. It's proven to be an extremely profitable choice. Myrtles commands premium prices for rooms and tour packages, generates substantial revenue from paranormal investigation events, and benefits from constant media coverage that treats the ghost stories as credible. Meanwhile, actual historical research into the plantation's role in the slave economy, the lives of enslaved people who worked there, and the long-term consequences of plantation wealth remains underfunded and largely ignored by visitors who've come for scares rather than education. This is our collective choice as a society. We've decided that entertainment value outweighs historical honesty. Consider what a truly honest tour of Myrtles Plantation might look like. It would start not with ghost stories, but with the Tunica people who originally inhabited this land and their forced removal. It would detail exactly how David Bradford acquired the money to purchase the property and what his crimes in Pennsylvania actually entailed. It would name, to whatever extent possible, every enslaved person who worked there and detail the conditions of their bondage. It would explain the economics of plantation slavery in specific, concrete terms. How much enslaved people were forced to produce, how little they were given to survive on, how punishment was administered and for what offenses, how families were separated, how children born into slavery at Myrtles were valued on plantation ledgers, how women experienced plantation life differently than men, subject to additional forms of exploitation and violence. It would trace the transfer of wealth from plantation operations through subsequent generations, showing exactly how slavery's legacy continued long after legal abolition. It would connect Myrtles' specific history to broader patterns of racial inequality in Louisiana and across the South. It would acknowledge uncomfortable truths about how historical injustice creates present-day inequality. Instead, we get stories about Chloe's ghost. We get claims about being America's most haunted house. We get overnight paranormal investigations where people spend hundreds of dollars to hear old houses make old house sounds and interpret them as supernatural activity. We get entertainment that allows us to feel like we've engaged with history without actually challenging ourselves. This isn't to say that everyone who visits Myrtles or enjoys ghost stories is somehow morally deficient. The problem isn't individual tourists who are just looking for a fun, spooky experience. The problem is the broader system that allows and encourages us to avoid confronting difficult history. The problem is a tourism industry that profits from sanitizing slavery. The problem is a society that's more comfortable with ghosts than with genocide, more willing to believe in supernatural entities than to reckon with human evil. The real haunting of Myrtles Plantation isn't supernatural. It's the way this place represents choices we continue to make about what to remember and what to forget, what to honor and what to exploit, what to confront and what to avoid. Every time someone pays for a ghost tour instead of demanding comprehensive historical interpretation, we're making a choice. Every time a television show features Myrtles as a spooky location without meaningfully addressing its history, we're making a choice. Every time we share ghost stories without sharing the real stories of enslaved people, we're making a choice. These choices have consequences. They shape how new generations understand American history. They influence what we think is important to preserve and memorialize. They determine whose stories get told and whose get erased. And they allow us to maintain comfortable distance from uncomfortable truths about the country we live in and how it became what it is. The photographic evidence that paranormal enthusiasts collect at Myrtles tells us nothing about ghosts, but quite a lot about what we want to believe. We want to believe that the worst horrors of history leave some kind of supernatural residue, that evil can be detected and documented through electromagnetic field readings or infrared cameras. We want to believe that places where terrible things happened retain some essence of that suffering that we can measure and study and ultimately turn into entertainment. But suffering doesn't work that way. Trauma doesn't become electromagnetic anomalies. Historical atrocity doesn't leave ghostly imprints that paranormal investigators can detect. What it does leave is documentary evidence if we care to look for it. Property records, slave sale receipts, plantation ledgers, death records, court documents, newspaper accounts. These tell us exactly what happened at Myrtles Plantation. They're just less exciting than ghost stories. The emphasis on paranormal activity also creates a false equivalence between different types of suffering. When ghost tours mention that 10 people died violently at Myrtles, they're typically referring to white property owners. The deaths of enslaved people, despite being far more numerous and occurring under far more brutal circumstances, somehow don't rate the same level of supernatural significance in these narratives. Even in death, even in the ghost stories we tell, there's a hierarchy of whose suffering matters. This extends to how different deaths are framed. When Ruffin Sterling was shot and died on the staircase, it's presented as a tragic murder, a mystery that adds to the property's dark allure. When enslaved people died from overwork, disease, or violence, these deaths are mentioned, if at all, as background context rather than individual tragedies. The implicit message is clear. Some lives were more valuable, even in death. The architecture of Myrtles itself tells this story. The main house, with its elaborate details and careful preservation, stands in stark contrast to the slave quarters, which were either demolished or allowed to decay. Modern visitors photograph the chandelier and the staircase, but rarely ask where enslaved people slept, ate, or spent what little free time they had. The physical space has been preserved in a way that centers the experience of enslavers and marginalizes the experience of the enslaved. This selective preservation isn't accidental. It reflects choices about whose history matters, whose stories deserve to be told, and what we want to remember about our past. By maintaining the big house in all its antebellum glory while erasing the physical evidence of slavery's brutality, we can pretend that plantation life was somehow elegant or refined, as long as we don't think too hard about who was doing the actual work. The guest rooms at Myrtles, where visitors now sleep in period-appropriate luxury, were spaces of profound inequality in the plantation era. While white family members slept on imported mattresses under fine linens, enslaved people slept on rough pallets in crowded quarters. While the family dined on elaborate meals, enslaved people subsisted on minimal rations. While the family enjoyed leisure time, enslaved people worked from dawn to dusk every day. But modern visitors experience only the luxury side of this equation, carefully curated and marketed for maximum appeal. Some might argue that ghost tourism at least keeps these historic properties financially viable, allowing them to be preserved for future generations. But preservation for what purpose? If we're preserving beautiful architecture while erasing the historical context that created it, are we actually preserving history or just maintaining pretty buildings? If the story we tell about these places is fundamentally dishonest, what value does their preservation serve? There are alternative models. Some historic sites have committed to telling more complete, honest stories about slavery and its legacy. They've hired historians who specialize in enslaved people's history. They've conducted archaeological research to understand how enslaved people lived. They've worked with descendant communities to incorporate their perspectives and knowledge. They've created exhibits and interpretive programs that don't shy away from difficult truths. These sites often face pushback from visitors who find the information uncomfortable or who claim it's too political, but they're doing necessary work. Myrtles Plantation could make different choices. It could hire historians to research and document the lives of enslaved people who worked there. It could create exhibits about the slave economy and how plantation wealth shaped Louisiana's development. It could partner with organizations that work on racial justice and reconciliation. It could use its platform and resources to educate rather than just entertain. These choices would likely reduce short-term profitability, but would serve the greater good of honest historical memory. Instead, the current model continues. Ghost tours run nightly. Paranormal investigation teams book overnight sessions. Television shows feature Myrtles in their most haunted specials. Social media fills with spooky photographs and breathless accounts of supernatural encounters. And the real history, the documented horror of what actually happened there, remains largely ignored. This isn't just about one plantation in Louisiana. Myrtles represents a broader pattern of how American society deals with uncomfortable history. We're willing to acknowledge that slavery happened and that it was wrong, but we're reluctant to confront its full implications or its ongoing legacy. We prefer simplified narratives that allow us to feel like we're the good guys, descended from the good guys, living in a country that has always aspired to live up to its ideals. The reality is far messier. The United States was built in large part through the exploitation of enslaved labor. The wealth generated through plantation slavery-funded industrial development financed westward expansion and created family fortunes that persist today. The legal and social structures that subordinated black people didn't end with the 13th Amendment. They evolved into sharecropping, convict leasing, Jim Crow, redlining, mass incarceration, and ongoing racial disparities in every measurable metric of well-being. Myrtles Plantation is a physical monument to this history. Every board in that house, every brick in its foundation, every tree in its gardens is connected to this legacy of exploitation and inequality. Ghost stories let us visit this monument without confronting what it represents. They let us be scared without being challenged. They let us engage with history as entertainment rather than as a moral reckoning. The question isn't whether Myrtles Plantation is actually haunted. The question is whether we're willing to be haunted by the truth, whether we're willing to let the documented reality of slavery and its aftermath disturb our comfort, whether we're willing to acknowledge that the beautiful old plantations we photograph and admire were sites of systematic human rights violations, whether we're willing to connect that historical horror to present-day inequality. These aren't easy questions, and they don't have simple answers, but they're questions we should be asking, instead of whether that orb in the photograph is really a ghost or just a camera artifact. They're questions we should be grappling with instead of debating whether Chloe's spirit really walks the halls at night. They're questions that matter in a way that paranormal speculation simply doesn't. The legacy of Myrtles Plantation, like the legacy of slavery itself, isn't confined to the past. It lives in the present in wealth disparities, educational inequities, health outcome differences, and every other measure of racial inequality in American society. It lives in the geographic patterns of where people of different races tend to live, which can often be traced directly back to plantation-era property ownership and post-Civil War segregation. It lives in family wealth, or lack thereof, passed down through generations in ways that compound over time. When we reduce this legacy to ghost stories, when we market it as spooky entertainment, when we allow tourists to enjoy a thrilling overnight stay without confronting any of this reality, We're actively choosing to forget. We're participating in a collective amnesia about our history and its consequences. We're prioritizing comfort and entertainment over truth and justice. And perhaps, most troublingly, we're teaching the next generation to do the same. Children visit Myrtles on school trips and ghost tours, learning about mysterious hauntings, but not about the documented realities of slavery. They see the beautiful architecture and hear the scary stories, but don't learn about the people who built that beauty through forced labor or the systematic violence that maintained the plantation system. They leave with memories of a fun, spooky experience rather than any understanding of actual history. This matters because how we remember the past shapes how we understand the present and what we think is possible for the future. If we teach people that slavery was a regrettable but concluded chapter of American history, we make it harder for them to see its ongoing effects. If we let people believe that the only haunting presence of slavery is supernatural, we obscure its very real, very material legacy. If we turn sites of historical atrocity into tourist attractions that prioritize entertainment over education, we demonstrate that some people's suffering matters less than other people's amusement. The staff at Myrtles, the tour guides who share ghost stories night after night, aren't necessarily acting with ill intent. Many probably believe in the supernatural elements they describe. Many are likely just doing their jobs, repeating the narratives they've been trained to share. But intent doesn't determine impact. The effect of these ghost tours, regardless of anyone's intentions, is to sanitize and commercialize a site of human suffering. The visitors who book rooms at Myrtles, who join the ghost tours, who participate in paranormal investigations, aren't necessarily bad people. Most are probably just looking for a fun experience, a chance to stay in a historic property and maybe see something spooky. But we're all responsible for thinking critically about the entertainment we consume and the historical narratives we accept. We're all responsible for asking what's being left out of the stories we're told. In the end, the dark story of Myrtles Plantation isn't the one being sold on ghost tours. It's not about mysterious orbs or phantom footsteps or the ghost of Chloe and her green turban. The real dark story is about a society that built enormous wealth through human bondage, that fought a war to preserve that system, that spent another century enforcing racial subordination through legal and extra-legal violence, that now turns the physical sites of that history into profitable entertainment venues, where uncomfortable truths can be avoided in favor of comfortable scares. The real dark story is about choices we continue to make every day, about what to remember and what to forget, whose stories to tell and whose to erase, what to preserve and what to let decay. It's about a nation still unwilling to fully reckon with its foundational sins, still looking for ways to engage with history that don't require too much discomfort or too much change. Myrtles Plantation stands as a monument to all of this. Not because it's uniquely evil. There were thousands of plantations throughout the South, each with its own specific horrors, but because it perfectly encapsulates our collective approach to this history. We acknowledge it just enough to feel like we're being honest while avoiding the full implications. We turn it into entertainment that lets us feel like we're engaging with the past while actually keeping it at a safe distance. We preserve the beautiful buildings while erasing the brutal context that created them. And every night, tour guides lead groups through those halls, sharing stories of ghosts and hauntings and mysterious phenomena. Every night, visitors thrill to tales of the supernatural while the real horror of what happened there, documented in historical records that no one bothers to read, remains quietly ignored. Every night, the cycle continues, and the real dark story of Myrtles Plantation, the story of American slavery and its enduring legacy, goes untold. This is the choice we've made. We can make different choices anytime we want. We can demand better from historic sites. We can seek out accurate historical information instead of entertaining ghost stories. We can support organizations working for honest historical memory and racial justice. We can acknowledge uncomfortable truths about our past and their connection to our present. We can be haunted by history instead of by fabricated hauntings. But as long as we prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths, as long as we're more interested in orbs on photographs than in ownership documents, as long as we allow places like Myrtles to profit from sanitized history and supernatural speculation, we're choosing to forget. And that choice, that willful amnesia about who we were and who we are, might be the darkest story of all.